Our Littleton City Council study session for Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. We are here with Planning Commission, and Karina will not be here tonight. Councilman Elrod will not be here tonight. And this is our new seating for council. We're a little closer tonight because the Planning Commission is nice. Also, a reminder from our workshop, we talked to council about not using our cell phones unless we absolutely have to, or you take it just as a reminder. So our first item is going to be the 20-074. It's the joint leadership kickoff for the Unified Land Use Code. And Mark.
Hey, Mayor.
So we're giving ourselves 90 minutes on this one.
Yes, and I'm going to immediately turn it over to
me.
Kathleen.
Yes, thank you.
She'll do the introductions here.
I'm going to immediately turn it over to.
Right. So good evening, welcome members of council and planning commission. We're excited to kick off the Unified Land Use Code work this evening. As most of you know, the commitment to Envision Littleton was a multi-year commitment that involves a lot of milestones. This is one of the next steps, building on the work of creating a unifying vision and a comprehensive plan. The unifying vision adopted in 2018, December 2018, and the comprehensive plan adopted in October of 2019. We have shared with council on multiple occasions that we view this as a process of discovery. I think that that's a message that you probably have also heard as members of Planning Commission. We know that there's going to be a journey over the next 2 years in terms of working with our community. We have drastically changed any scope you've ever seen in working with our great partners, Kendrick Keast Collaborative. So we have a new team to introduce tonight that'll be working through this process with us. But what we've achieved is a very highly customized process that I think fits us and our community really well. And it does allow for that discovery, that discussion, and really kind of building on the process. So we're gonna walk you through what to expect as part of that. And we're also going to really this evening have an opportunity for you to ask those questions in terms of the process, but also get a good sense of the timeline and expectations from both City Council and Planning Commission. So I'm pleased to introduce this evening Brett Keast, CEO of Kendrick Keast Collaborative, and Brian Mabry, that's out of the Louisville, did I say that right? Louisville, Kentucky office. So Brett is in Sugarland in Houston, where you would remember Gary and Meredith came to us from. So it's a pleasure to have them both here this evening. I think for a few members of council that were able to join us this evening, this is a similar presentation, but we know that this conversation will be, again, another great opportunity for you to ask some of those questions. So
Great.
with that,
Thank you, Catherine.
welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Pleased to be with you. We look forward to this process of having many other conversations like this. When I started, this is starting my 31st year in this business. When I started the firm back in 2003, we started thinking about a name for the company. It just kind of came to me that it needed to be Kendrick Keast Collaborative. And we take that to heart in that all our processes must be collaborative. And as I told folks last night, this is not a Kendrick Keast product. This is a Littleton, Colorado product. And we are simply here to guide and to draft and help this community realize the vision that has come from a lot of your hard work and a lot of input from this community. So we view this as being a highly collaborative effort. We had an opportunity to spend about 2.5 hours this morning with staff and told them that that would be a short meeting, that we want to spend time with them. They bring a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information and experience themselves. They know the ins and outs of properties, they know people and personalities, they know, just so much from their different perspectives. And so we're gonna really rely on them and collaborate with them in drafting. And the same applies to the folks in this room tonight, that there'll be opportunities where we will come to you and say, we've talked through all these things and we need some guidance, we need some direction. There's 2 or 3 different ways that we could take this, and we would like council to give us some, policy guidance so that we can proceed. If we do that and do it well, and we reach out to folks in the community, as you have done through the comp plan, we have every expectation that this process can go smooth. It won't be without its bumps. We realize that every community has those moments. But when we get to the point of having this back before you for commission recommendation and council adoption, hopefully we will have worked through all those. We will have talked to a lot of the people and worked with them to find solutions and find a code that we can all live with. As we expressed last night, and we will again, that there is no perfect code. There's no such thing. That there will be changes, and we'll continue to learn and discover once you start putting it in place. And everybody may not love every single paragraph and every single page, but we want to get to the point where everybody can live with it and they agree that it's a good document and it's moving this community in the direction that you all want to go. So this is a unified land use code, and essentially what that means is anybody that comes into any process that's going to do something on a piece of ground in this property needs to have a single set of regulations. You, like many communities over time, have addressed different issues and created different guidelines and standards and documents and operating procedures and standards and things like that to address different issues. And what happens is over the course of time, they probably stray further and further apart. You start getting conflicts and inconsistencies, and it's hard to manage them all. So we're gonna be grabbing all those like this and pulling them all together and putting them all into a single document, so that somebody that comes into this process will be able to find what they're looking for in the simplest and quickest way possible, supported by technology that we'll talk to you a little bit about, so that they can move through this process as quickly and in conformance with what your expectations are. So I'm gonna just kind of talk through a few things here tonight, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Brian. He's gonna drill down a little bit more into some of the schedule and the particular scope, and certainly if there's any questions, we wanna make sure everybody goes away satisfied that we have responded to those. So I think all of you, probably through Gary and through Meredith, have a pretty good idea of what Kidney Keys is about. All of us have worked for local government, and so when we find people, we are specifically looking for people that have sat in the chairs of your staff and understand how these processes work and how they apply and the challenges that come up with them and how to work them through processes. So we have done zoning and land development regulations for over 175 communities. This is an area that I specialize in, and where my passion and love is working through this process. So we have all the staff and resources to bring to bear, and working with your staff to finish this project on time and on budget. We're going to talk to you a little bit more about our internet-based software and how that will lend itself to this process, not only the drafting, but more importantly, when we're done, how it can dramatically improve the experience that people have coming to Littleton and working with your regulations. Some of you may be familiar with Norrie Winter. Winter & Company is in Boulder. They have worked all over the nation. We believe from our work with them that there is no better urban design firm in the US than Norrie and his staff. So they're going to be working with us most visibly on the downtown building block that we're preparing to enter into next. But they also have a lot of expertise in historic preservation, so we'll be tapping into that knowledge as well, and making sure that we're drafting regulations that are practical and doable and as simple and straightforward as they can be, but at the same time legally defensible and effective. So they will be working with us. They do wonderful graphics to help illustrate regulations so people can really understand what things mean. A little bit about our philosophy as we cross this bridge into drafting regulations is the idea of be as simple as possible, meaning that we try to draft a regulation about what you can do rather than what you can't. We try finding multiple paths to yes. So we want people to be approved, we want them to contribute to our economic development in a positive manner, and we want their experience to be good working through that process along with staff. So we try to organize the code well, write very articulately, use graphics to help illustrate so people can understand what they mean and can work with staff to gain adopted or approved applications. Probably the two most critical words in this whole process are predictability and certainty. And that is for y'all, but that is also for the people that are coming and investing large sums of money here, that they want to know that if I'm going to spend a lot of money, that I've got a high degree of certainty that I can get approved if I follow the rules. And so we want to lay out the rules out in black and white so that they can read the code and know what the expectations are. They can see where the bar is set and what they need to meet to gain approval. We have worked all across the country, and 100% of the time, all the developers we've worked with have all said consistently, set the regulations wherever you're going to set the regulations, set the bar, we'll meet it, but move us through the process and treat us all fairly. So they don't want to see different decisions for different similar applications. They don't want to be hung up in a lot of discretionary processes where they don't really know what the answers are until they come before you. So y'all need clarity. y'all need good regulations you can rely on, and so does staff. And so we try to write that out in black and white. Now to do that takes words, and words go in sentences, and those add pages. But the idea is that we don't want to put too much emphasis on the number of pages, because the whole idea is if we spell out everything clearly and articulately, then it actually simplifies the ordinance. It doesn't make it more complex, even though there may be more words. So we have to express those things so they know, what they're to meet, and staff can rely on those regulations of knowing that there's not going to be a lot of holes and interpretations and things that we have to, argue over what this means. And then we know that the market is very important. We know that economics are very important. So there's probably several screening criteria that are going to apply across all these building blocks, which we'll explain to you in a moment. We know that fiscal responsibility and economic sustainability are important. We know that the environment is important. We know that historic preservation is important. We know that neighborhood conservation and protection of people's investment is important. So there's all these things that all together, they're not focused in one area or another, but those are things that we're going to be looking at across the board through all these different sections we're going to be writing. And we feel like that people need to be able to find their path forward. We need to create value for them. Oftentimes we do that by giving them incentive, not in the way of financial incentive, but by way of giving them a clear path to what the city would like to achieve. And if they do, they're going to have the biggest rewards. So whether that looks like expedited process, whether that looks like administrative approvals to help speed things up, whether that looks like some type of bonus, in floor area bonus or other types of things, we'll work through all those issues and find out what fits for this community, but they need to be able to see the path and what the end game is. And then one size doesn't fit all. So as Kathleen said, one of my first introductions to her was, she asked me early on, submit a scope, but it sat for a while, and she called me back and says, yeah, that's not gonna work. So we went about crafting, from everything that we know about this community, crafting a scope of work that is unique to Littleton. And Brian will explain a little bit more about that process coming up here. But we can either, make everything very rigid and everything very black and white without a whole lot of flexibility, or we can create menus and options and things of that nature. So we prefer the latter, where, as I said, we can give multiple paths to yes. So being able to create, perhaps different development options where any of them are approvable, subject to the standards. The developer really has his choice, and then we can kind of help them make the decisions that are right for the community and how those regulations are drafted. So you all have gone through the comprehensive plan process. I'm sure you now have a much better feel for the amount of effort, the amount of time that goes into that process, but what's come out of it. And it's a policy document that is still at 20,000 foot. We're going to be bringing this to 3 feet because it's pretty easy to appreciate a lot of the broader policy statements in a plan, but when we start writing the law and suddenly saying, now you must do these things, we get oftentimes different thoughts or feedback. So we have to be cognizant of that as we go into this and keep our eyes wide open and be willing to adapt and to adjust as we go to work around the community. So whereas the plan is fairly, it's articulate but still fairly broad, the devil in the details gets down in writing the regulations. So where the plan can be a little flexible, the code is not quite as flexible because it's a legal document. And so whereas lines may change on a future land use map, when it comes to zoning, they're not going to change unless we go through a legal process to change them, as I think all of you can appreciate. This process will be putting a lot more meat on the bone than what we're able to do in the comprehensive plan. It will be much more detailed and kind of requires a certain level of expertise or aptitude get into writing regulations versus plan language. You have the future land use character map, which is what the FLUCM stands for. That is a guiding document for us. In a perfect world, when we get done, you will have the same zoning districts as you have land use districts, so it's very clear of how they relate to one another. We'll spell out the standards to help achieve the character that those expressed in words in the comp plan. And the comprehensive plan usually is changed every 5 years. Potentially you could do a future land use map change if there's something significant that were to come to town. But otherwise it stays fairly static, whereas rezonings, you could have more rezonings over the course of time than you will have future land use maps. So it tends to be a little bit more fluid than does the future land use character map. So that is a little bit about the process of transitioning from the comprehensive plan into the development regulations. Brian's going to drill down a little bit further in terms of the process, the steps in the process, and explain our scope and where we're going.
Thanks again to everyone here and good evening. So there are several goals for this project, and they are kind of fundamental guideposts for what we are wanting to accomplish in this Unified Land Use Code rewrite. I kind of changed the order of some of these check marks, but really because the overall goal of almost any rewrite of a set of regulations is to implement the comprehensive plan. That's foundational for zoning regulations or land use regulations. So that, again, taking the broader policies that are set forth in the comprehensive plan and turning them into laws. And a unified land use code is a document that's adopted by ordinance by the city council as a law. And so that's really the most fundamental of goals for this project. We also want to, as part of this project, continually evaluate what you currently have in your existing regulations and look for ways that your existing regulations aren't doing the job of implementing the policies in your plan. So we would be doing that for the city as a whole, but also for each of the building blocks, which we'll describe in a moment. So that's going to be a big part of this project as well, is constant evaluation of where we're at in terms of implementing the plan. Unified Land Use Code. Unified is a key word in that document title. A big part of this project is gathering everything together, like Brett said, and putting it into one document so that someone doing a development has in one location and in one source book everything he or she's going to need to know to go from potentially changing the zoning of a property to doing the site plan type work of the project to doing the buildings themselves to getting the certificate of occupancy so that the house can be moved into or the business can open its doors and start having customers. And then all of these things need to happen with high levels of public engagement and interaction. Public engagement being gauging the temperature or the barometer of what the public would like to see happen. That is crucial and probably a little easier to do for a comprehensive plan because you're dealing with things that lay people can easily often identify with, like more visual questions about how what kind of styles of buildings maybe someone would like to see in certain parts of town, or what types of landscaping look good in different areas. With a code, it's again a lot more technical, a lot more legal. We try to make them a document like this easy to understand, as easy as we can make a legal document be for the average person to understand. But it is, again, technical stuff and a lot less pictures than a plan has, even though we do want to have graphics in here to make it more understandable. So engaging the public and getting their thoughts will be an important part of this project. I mentioned kind of the having an attractive document, and that's something we definitely want to have. We want to go from your current regulations on the left with a lot of words and a picture here and there to something that is a lot more interactive and user friendly, as you would see on the right, where you have you can view the code itself that has tables in it and the use of colors that draw the eye and that lead you kind of through the document that's sort of in a big outline. If you want to think of what a unified land use code really looks like if you're thumbing through it, it's a big outline really that has different levels in a hierarchy. We want to be able to have tools that are part of the code that let you let a person see what kind of landscaping they would need to provide if they wanted to do a bookstore next to a house or a sort of a manufacturing type development next to a shopping center. Make it easy and clear about how many plantings they would need along that shared property line, or how many plantings they need along a certain type of street, so that it makes the work a lot easier to do a development from the applicant's side. It makes the public who might be a neighbor to a bigger development be able to understand what might be going on next door and what they could see in terms of protection and buffering from what's going to take place on the other property. So these are important and will be a big part of this project. Our process for doing codes is very iterative, and by that I mean the typical process is that we would learn all we can about a building block area, downtown or a mixed use area or major corridors or what have you. Learn all we can, go back and do some preliminary work on what we think the direction should be for that part of the code. Come back and present it on another trip, and then take what we learned and refine our written draft when we get back to our offices. So that part of that is keeping you all up to date, keeping the staff up to date on what's in those drafts, so that we get as good of a feedback as we can get. It's like a big feedback loop where we're constantly trying to refine our work on this document, so that it, as accurately as we can make it, reflects your all's will. We're kind of the scribes, and you're telling us what to put in there based on our best practices that we've learned working across the country and over the years, but also working in what Littleton wants to see in this document. So we would have a staff technical team that would be very mindful of enforcement, administration, how things could be interpreted line by line in this document. And they would be providing us a lot of feedback in great detail, and also having what we're thinking of as a staff advisory committee, which would be potentially made of sort of design professionals or people who are very much power users of a document like this, so that they can kind of give their angle on some of these things and try to make this document as good as it can be. We'll try to, and we will keep City Council and Planning Commission brief periodically on where we are in the big picture in this project, so that when it comes time for adoption, it's not like you've not heard anything about what's going on. We've said yesterday, we hope that the adoption for this document is as boring as it can be. If there's no activity for that item on the hearing, we would couldn't be happier. So all of this
We're
goes.
optimists.
Yeah, we can dream. We're planners, we can dream, can't we? So in the end, this document would get published in Encode Plus, which is our platform for hosting codes, and as you saw in the previous slide with the comparing the before and after, a very interactive and user-friendly approach to showing documents like this. If I had met Kathleen sooner, this visual might be of an accordion instead of a funnel. Kathleen likes the accordion analogy where you start off
They remember that.
everyone remembers that, so I don't really need to explain it that much, but you can also think of it as a funnel where we're starting off this week with these very introductory meetings, kind of kicking off the project. We've done a guided tour yesterday and I think I took 150 pictures of the city, and then Brett and I this afternoon did some more driving specifically downtown, and I think I took 150 more just for downtown. So we're getting our brains fed with everything we can know about Littleton, and we'll take that to the next level, which we'll be working on this evaluation and an annotated outline, which I'll explain more about in a moment. And then again, with each building block draft, giving our initial thoughts, getting feedback, taking it back and refining that draft a little more so that we work down and get more precise, more detailed, more customized for the city until we get to adoption with what we again hope will be a document that not everyone may be 100% in love with, but that they can see was reasonably and rationally done and produced with a lot of public engagement. Keep saying building blocks. This shows you what we mean by that. We've broken up the city into 5 building blocks that will serve as sort of geographic guides for how we're doing this document, the Unified Land Use Code. This is not our typical approach, but it's the Littleton approach that we're going for. We will, with each of these building blocks, which if you can't see, I think that's everyone can probably see that, but neighborhood block area is the yellow, and that's sort of the stable residential areas that are not projected to be changing much in the future and will kind of stay like they are. The downtown block area in the orange, mixed use block areas, and these reflect a lot of the comprehensive plan's future land use and character map is sort of the broad basis for coming up with this map. Mixed use block areas, as I said, is a little bit east of downtown. Business and commercial block areas down to the south, more the shopping center, auto-oriented developments, and then major corridors, those areas that are more linear as opposed to kind of blocks, big blocks of retail or office areas. So with each building block, we'll be kind of focusing on these areas of the city. To kind of put a timeline to that, we've got the 5 building blocks on the screen ranging from really next month, beginning our work on the downtown building block, all the way over to April of next year, where we would finish the modular pieces of this document. With each building block, with each geographic building block of the downtown corridors, mixed use neighborhoods, and business commercial, we would have some topical stuff related in there as well. So with downtown, we would also be working on the general provisions, which are really kind of the legalese part of a document like this that you can't really avoid, where we talk about where we get the authority to zone, where we get how we transition over from the old regulations to the new and things like that, and then getting the zoning districts really going, where we try to lay out a framework for not only the downtown zoning districts, but parts of other zoning districts that will exist in the city in different areas. This has some key dates laid out for you, especially here in the beginning, where we're doing the first bullet right now, but then in March we'll be coming back for our first trip related to a building block, which will be downtown, where we will do high levels of engagement to get people's opinions on what shortcomings your current regulations have in terms of how your downtown is developed and redeveloped. Then we would have another trip in May where we come back again and show our work and show what we've done to try to address what we learned in the first trip. And then finally, providing one more revision to that building block in June of this year. And so that happens several times with each building block until we get to June 1st, where right now we would say that we would have a public hearing draft ready to be published and reviewed and open to public comment, which would last from June 1st to July 26th, where at that point the public of next year, yes, of 2021, where at that point, you know, the kind of book would be closed, but then we would have the public hearings where again, the verbal comments would be, you know, welcomed and for the planning commission and the city council to hold their hearings and their eventual adoption leading into October of 2021. A little bit on the zoning evaluation, just gonna be as visually and layperson oriented as we can get and organized by building block, where we talk about the different ways and different options of zoning, different styles of zoning that you could go with to try to reach the outcomes that the comprehensive plan is recommending. We would be talking about how to streamline things so that maybe there's some steps we can save in terms of how a variance is approved, or maybe trying to avoid variances altogether in some situations, so that again the staff can make some decisions rather than having to have a public hearing for certain things. Where state law and, you know, stuff like that would require hearings, of course we would still do that, but there might be parts of the regulations that could allow fewer hearings, and that often is a win-win for a lot of people. The annotated outline is more of a technical document, but what you all would really get out of it is a sneak preview of the table of contents for the new code, how it's going to be arranged from start to finish. It would also have, that would basically be the left side of the document, the left side of the table that you can kind of see a preview of there from another community, where the left side has the table of contents, which is going to probably change. It almost always does change when we're doing a project like this. It morphs because we run into something that needs addressing and we can't quite make it work in the structure we originally proposed, and so we move things around. But generally it'll be, you know, 85 to 90% what you're going to see in the final document. On the right side, the right column of the table is your where your existing regulations fit into that. And really, from what we're learning on this first trip, you know, it's going to be a major overhaul, and we're going to probably not have a lot of it left in the end because it is a very dated document. There's parts that have been amended rather recently that will probably, you know, carry over, but a lot of it is going to just be replaced with contemporary best practices for how a code in 2020 and 2021 and on should look. So on the right, you'll get kind of a view of where your existing provisions would kind of fit in there in the overall outline. We like to organize our codes, as I mentioned, with kind of the essential things up front for when a citizen, layperson who has never opened a code before like this and probably never will again after they get their variance or their rezoning or whatever they're going for, having up front what the zoning districts are, what kinds of uses can take place in them, and what the setbacks and building heights are, and some other measurements like that. Other than that, you know, most of the time an average person isn't going to care about what comes after that. So having that at the front, and then in the second half, kind of the things that the attorneys or the designers really want to know about buffering or parking design, or the real technical procedures and processes that have to happen for an approval to take place. And then kind of like a glossary in the back having all the definitions and what those words mean. We have done a little bit of background work with several different cities that are your neighbors, and wanted to just kind of give a snapshot of what their regulations currently look like from a very high view. Englewood has a few different residential, but only two non-residential and some mixed-use zoning districts. As far as adjacency to Littleton, they have, as far as what's right on your city limits, some residential and some mixed use and an industrial district. There has been some questions and concerns we've heard about what the city of Littleton can do about its adjacencies to these other cities where you don't have any control or say about what they're doing, just like they don't have really any control or say about what you're doing. So we're gonna have to look at that and make sure we are sensitive to those edges of the city that abut your neighbors. They have 148 land uses, so bookstore, barbershop, brewery, whatever the case may be, all listed out in a big matrix. The trend is to be a little less focused on land uses and more focused on community character and forms of buildings and how they relate to the street and what kinds of environments the developments create, as opposed to whether a dog grooming business can go next to a library or something like that. It's more about the creation of character that these developments make. They have some, for nowadays, sort of more common, but a little more leading edge, maybe parking requirements, where they have some bicycle parking requirements, where if you provide a certain amount of bicycle parking as a business, then you can cut back on the number of vehicle parking spaces you would have to provide. They have some exemptions from parking for certain kinds of uses, so that's we're seeing that a lot all over, and they're no exception in Englewood. For Sheridan, they don't have any mixed use districts, sort of like Littleton, but they do have a few residential and non-residential districts. Along your borders are mostly industrial and residential zoning for Sheridan. They have their uses all listed out as opposed to being in a table. We kind of usually default to the table approach, where you can have lists of uses on the rows, and then the columns are different zoning districts, and you figure out, here's the use, here's the district, and if there's a P there, that means it's permitted. If there's a blank there, that means you can't do it. So that's kind of the approach we often take. Their landscaping, they have buffering, kind of like what you would see in most places related to streets and to uses that are right next to each other. Centennial, similar probably to some others in the area, they have several different types of zoning districts. Their adjacent uses are neighborhood commercial and area commercial with some business park in there as well. They have similar parking allowances as the first city we looked at, Englewood. They allow the director to make certain reductions. We would rather spell out parking reductions like this, but also maybe give the director some leeway in allowing some reductions. But our big thing is to spell out and be articulate. It might add length to a paper document, but everyone's going to be looking at this online anyway, probably. So you don't notice pages as much when you're doing that. Lakewood, just a few more to talk about here. They have a kind of an even mix of residential, mixed use, and non-residential, and they have some of the same things. They have motorcycle and scooter bonuses or reductions that can happen if you provide those kind of things and don't have to provide quite as many parking spaces for conventional vehicles. Denver has its own thing going with these different combinations of kind of contexts and uses and lot sizes all in one district. It can be honestly, to me, kind of confusing, like IMX3. It's not very intuitive for most people about what that might mean. We try to be a little more simpler in our names of zoning districts. BP is business park, SR suburban residential. Those are some typical nomenclature we try to use to be a little more intuitive on what we're getting at. And finally, Littleton has even mix of residential and non-residential districts, along with an agricultural and special purpose, but not a called out specific mixed use district. And when I say mixed use, just so everybody's on the same page, you know, that would typically mean either horizontal mixed use, where you've got in one development maybe apartments, office, and retail in a unified development, or even not necessarily apartments, maybe conventional single family housing. That's kind of horizontal mixed use, and then there's vertical mixed use, where there's some type of retail or activity that's more active and lively on the first floor to kind of enliven the street, and then above that you have either residential or offices, or a mix of those two things. So that's kind of the horizontal and the vertical for mixed use regulations. So that's kind of an overview of what some of your neighbors are doing. And you know, it doesn't hurt to sometimes make sure that we're kind of coordinated, at least in some things. We probably wouldn't coordinate with exactly how Denver's doing their districts again, but just to know what they're doing is gonna be an important part of this. We have a few preliminary observations to talk about that I'll just go through quickly, where just some obvious stuff that relates to some of your plan recommendations, having more transitions so that you don't have such an abrupt picture as what you have on the screen now, with a very intense or very dense building on the left, and then just you know, conventional single family on the right, doing what we can to make that a better transition. Moving toward the concept of plan developments more by right rather than by negotiation and by public hearing, so that you have the ability, or an applicant or a developer has the ability to do, where appropriate, some mixing of housing types, whether it's single family detached and single family attached, that might be either integrated together or separated out with buffers, whatever ends up being appropriate for Littleton. Being able to do that without any special public hearings that involve an amount of time and expense. And finally, the third observation and final observation is looking at your mixed use, or looking at making some mixed use districts for you that would again be by right rather than negotiated out and public hearings where there's uncertainty on all sides in a lot of cases. We're eventually gonna have a project site. This URL isn't accurate, so don't write it down. The city will be hosting a project site that'll have a lot of information on it for you, as far as scheduling and deliverables that we've provided, stuff like that will be very helpful, I think, in the future. And that ends what Brett and I have to talk about, and we just wanna hear from you all what your questions or comments or concerns are for this project, so we're happy to take any of those.
I wanna point out, first of all, that we just went almost 45 minutes with nobody saying anything. That's a record.
I assume we were waiting to the end.
Holding it all in,
I've never stopped
so.
this before. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's open up to questions. Is that where you wanna go right now, Kathleen?
Yes.
Okay, Kathleen, what questions, Mark? There.
I've got one. You've got, you know, the five, I guess, what, 6 building blocks, one of them being water. Water would include the drainage ways, which lots of flora, fauna, kids' playground. I'd love to be a kid playing along those. But what you're missing is one of the 2 real gems we have in Littleton, and that's the river. I think it should be its own building block. There's so much development pressure on the river, so much opportunity, so much recreation. It's a spine that connects all the way from Chatfield to downtown Denver. That to me is would be its own separate building block. So talk me out of it, but I don't think just saying water would cover that.
So I think that's another one of those areas that cuts across all of these different areas. So
Yep.
similar like historic preservation, somebody asked, you know, that touches on neighborhoods from some of your historic neighborhoods, it touches on downtown. So that will be a topic that kind of cuts across, and we'll be addressing across all of those. In the same way, you know, the river from amenity and aesthetic to the environment will be one of those things that cuts across all of these. We know that that's a vital element of this community and its character, that we're not only concerned about the aesthetic and the open space along there and the how we interact with it, but we're also concerned about water quality and all those other things. So those will be, across all the different building blocks, we'll be addressing each of those to make sure that we're protecting that river environment.
So it's spread out, but it's included in all the other
Yeah,
building
it will be
blocks.
very present and accounted for. I promise you that.
Has to be, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Scott?
Brett, I would just add to yours and Mark's comments that this concept of buffering, to my mind, is particularly useful along the river corridor. It's a place in our city where we see oftentimes dramatic transitions from a natural open space to something very contrary to that. And I would absolutely love to see transition zones in our
Yes, I mean, we'll certainly be looking at that along the river, but that applies in a lot of different places. Just interesting looking at some of your districts, where districts in their purpose statement, they say that they are to transition from this district to that district, but it goes from 5 units per acre to 40 units per acre. That's a hell of a transition. In fact, we have to soften that much better so you don't have these dramatic changes or the potential for dramatic changes, in your backyard or side yard or whatever that might be. So that will apply, commonly along rivers. You have, riparian buffers and things of that nature to help filter stormwater and manage that and provide, appropriate wetland areas and so forth, but also thinking about the scale of development and how it interfaces with the river environments and what the experience is when you're along the river. So you're not on the backs of buildings and the loading docks, but you have buildings that actually front the river and take advantage of that amenity. Granted, there's some things that, that have already happened, but that may not be what's there 20 or 30 years from now, so we have to anticipate those.
Carol, did you have something? Oh, I thought you were reserved.
You talked about historic preservation, and that's very important, especially in our first building block in downtown area. Where does that come in? I know the historic preservation code is in desperate need of update. Where does that fit in to this whole process?
It's part of it. So that's one of those kind of side elements that we'll be wrapping all into one document. The approach that we're taking here in Littleton, I'm excited about, because a traditional process, you might draft, the provisions and then the districts and the dimensional standards and so forth. And when people see that, they're going, well, that's great, but what are the parking requirements? What are the landscaping requirements? What are the sign requirements? Well, you're gonna have to wait for 9 months for that. What we're doing here is basically looking geographically at downtown and writing all the provisions that relate to downtown, so you kind of get to see it more in whole as it relates to downtown. So we'll organize the document so that it is intuitive and things will be grouped together so that most people, if they're looking for parking, it's not in 15 places throughout the code, it's together in a parking. So as we're writing downtown, we'll be writing the parts of parking that relate to downtown and how we're gonna park uses downtown. When we get into the the more auto-oriented areas, then we're drafting another section of the parking regulations that are appropriate for that context. So we're gonna be basically bringing the provisions that relate to downtown, we'll draft those. And then as we're moving into the next two use areas, then we'll draft, the remaining pieces. So as it relates to historic preservation, downtown we'll be writing, all things historic preservation as it relates to historic buildings downtown. You're gonna have procedures that kind of apply across the plane, right? But then when we get to neighborhoods, we'll be addressing historic preservation again for some of your residential historic areas. So I think it will be more understandable for you and for other folks to see how the code comes together in that manner. I think it'll make more sense.
I'm not clear.
Okay. Yes.
You talk about parking, I'm talking about, we have a downtown district.
Yep.
And then we have like historic areas, I think of, north of Main Street and then, Old Littleton, that residential area.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that historic preservation is included as part of the code on a more macro level, parking's an issue, I know, and pieces are this issue, but how do we make sure we keep the character?
Well, that's, if I can elaborate a little bit on what we're doing with downtown and how that process is gonna unfold. As Kathleen has said, it's discovery. So we're doing research and background study and mapping and things of that nature. When we're back in March, it's gonna be a very interactive, hands-on type of work where we're saying, this is the environment that exists. These are the regulations that got you here. What are the gaps? What does our vision say? And what do we want downtown to be in terms of not only the uses, but the forms and how these things relate to one another, how you can support historic preservation and the preservation of certain structures and how they relate to what's around them. And then the ways that you can get there, what differences or what new things would need to be in the regulations in order to reach your vision. And we have lots of conversation around that. We're building a 3D model of the whole downtown area that will allow us to kind of look at options and alternatives. We can start looking at historic properties and how we are more sensitive to them, what types of standards may be necessary for historic properties. I know you've got opt-in provisions right now, so we'll be talking through all those things and figuring out what's, how we're going forward. What are the standards that are going to protect those properties and protect the historic environments of the downtown. Obviously, a lot has changed in downtown as we see north, some of the developments that have already occurred. So we want to make sure that we're very clear in terms of accomplishing what the city wants to from a historic preservation perspective.
Patrick?
Hey Brett, how are you working with the city, with staff on our moratorium? And as you know, we have 90 days to kind of figure out downtown zoning. How are you working with us on that?
You want?
So, once they're done with their presentation, we will show you how it all ties together.
Perfect.
Okay, let's start with Sherry. I'm sorry, did you finish? Oh, Sherry, did you have any questions?
No.
Dan?
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question. How often do cities typically revise, retool their zoning code?
Honestly, I mean, when you do a wholesale effort, we would expect that this code would last for 20-25 years. Now, that's not to say that there's not gonna be changes, there will be changes. But basically the overall essence of it is, it's gonna take us for the next couple decades at least.
But, and so is ours 40 years old now? Okay, so it's, I mean, that's what I thought. It's long overdue. It's the use by date.
At least. Craig, did you have anything? Any questions, Craig?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
recognizing that the code update will primarily affect areas of change within the city. I think that'll be the most immediate effect. I wonder if there's things that we'll be talking about and building into the code that will also somehow incentivize the more stable neighborhoods to reinvest and perhaps, especially in infrastructure, maybe street trees, sidewalk gaps, that type of thing.
Yeah, you hit a good point. The areas that are yellow on there are, the vast majority of land area in the community. So the goal there is to conserve their characters, to make sure that we don't have any major disruptions in the things that maybe could happen under your current regulations. So that you can be secure and that the character of your neighborhood that you bought into is gonna be retained. And so there's a lot of things that we're able to do in terms of if there are issues of variance. Talking to staff, I said it's primarily sheds and fences and things of that nature. If there are things that we can spell out in the code that would enable people to do things to improve their property without changing the character, we could write them into the code so that the standards are very clear and they can get those approved administratively rather than going through a big process for something that's fairly simple but very few people are not gonna have any impacts. We've also done some things where we've had what we call non-conforming site improvements, where we write new standards and then you could have a certain period of time within which those standards come into effect. So ordinarily, you have to sit around and wait until a building permit issues or some type of trigger before you can get some of these things. That's one approach of doing it, or another approach is to take a more proactive step of saying after 5 years or 10 years or what have you, we want these things to occur. Usually happens more in the commercial areas than it does the residential areas. But we'll be looking very closely at the residential areas, the differences in how they were constructed, whether they have alleys or not, whether they have outbuildings or detached garages, attached garages, all those things that make those neighborhoods unique, and then drafting standards around them to preserve that character, but at the same time allowing some wiggle room so people can reinvest and improve their property and rehab their property without disrupting, the character that you're fond of.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. Brett, at your presentation last night, you touched on some definitions of character. It may be useful for everyone in this room if you spoke directly to that for us, since it's such a central concept to everything.
Yeah.
And my other question is, Brian mentioned during his part of the presentation that the building block approach is not Ken Keith's typical approach. What is and why is the building block approach recommended for Littleton?
Okay, we can tackle those one at a time here. First of all, your ordinance, like nearly every ordinance across the country, was written at a time where everything was predicated upon the use of property. But I think you can appreciate that uses can be in different contexts, so the design is much different. So we can have a restaurant that is on Broadway or is on Santa Fe, and we also have a restaurant downtown. It's the same exact use. So the use has very little to do with the context of how that use functions and operates. So a use in downtown, you have a much different set of standards that are necessary to realize the character of downtown that you're looking for. Walkable storefronts, on-street parking, things of that nature. So when we've drafted ordinances that are predicated upon use, we get the types of environments and the conversations that we've had in this community of that's not necessarily what our preference is. So when you think about different residential areas, for instance, they're all single-family residential. You've got different lot sizes and setbacks. So we try to figure out a way that we can distinguish from one neighborhood to the other. So you have very large lot areas. They're single-family, but they just happen to be large lot and very low density. You have other areas that are smaller lots, more tightly woven together, but they may have, front driveways and attached garages, and other areas that are the original town areas that were developed much differently. So they all deserve their own sets of unique standards. If you try to create one district and drape it across all those areas, you just can't be effective in conserving what's special about those areas. And that's what this community has done, like every community. You have R1 areas that stretch across areas that are much different from one another. And so what we're going to be looking at is really getting into the characteristics, the measurable characteristics that help you to define what makes that area that area. So downtown, when we talk about from the rural areas all the way through the suburban areas, if you're familiar with the comp plan, to urban, I say that this community has every one of those stops along the way. You do not have urban core. Some people maybe don't agree with the term urban, but in this context of Littleton, urban is your downtown. And that is buildings that take up the entire lot. They're brought to the street. They don't have any side setbacks. That is much different than something that's built along one of your other corridors. So you've already started that process of laying out the land use plan. We will be building upon that in terms of how we draft standards. So suburban character area, a lot of people tend to think that that's buildings that are pretty or attractive. It's not. That's part of it. But when we talk about suburban commercial, we're talking about smaller scale buildings with pitched roofs that have more of a residential character and appearance. They have different types of uses. They don't have gas pumps and semi trucks and things of that nature. Something that could be on the edge of a neighborhood that could be cohesive with the neighborhood rather than being disruptive. So that's a little bit more about character. We'll be getting in a much greater detail and become more clear as we move into this process. Did that answer your question on character.
I'd like to be more specific
Was
about
that,
character.
was a two-part question though, what is?
I was getting ready to answer the second part, but I wanna answer her question on character.
I guess what I take away from some of this are like the things that are outlined in this document on what determines character density, layout, scale and form, building coverage, buffers, parking, degree of green.
Materials.
Is that, building, I mean, to me,
Building
that's what I'm.
materials creates an aesthetic, but what we're looking at is all those things that you just talked about, that in different contexts, you have different scales of building. They cover more or less of the lot, they have more or less green space. They could be more suburban where they have more pervious cover than impervious cover. And then when we talk about building form, building shape, where it's placed on the lot, all those things are going to be different from one area of town to another area of town, based largely upon either what's on the ground now and working cohesively with that, or setting a new pattern and making sure that anything that's built or rebuilt is reflecting the type of character that we want this community to be. Usually the areas that people dislike are what we call the auto-oriented uses that are largely parking lots that are unsightly, and then a building where the parking lot consumes more of the property than does the building. And so we have to think about, we can improve upon that with landscaping, the way you take access and circulate throughout it, and screening and buffering, bringing the building to the front, maybe putting parking to the side, to the rear. So there's a lot of different ways that we can carve that up, that we can create more functional sites, but also more attractive and aesthetic as you're driving along that corridor.
Bruce?
I think you've got a very compelling vision, and I think there's been obviously a lot of good work's gone into this already, so I think it's exciting. I wanted to inquire, your slide number 16 up there had project process key dates. And you've got the revised draft of building block 1 lined out for the week of June 1st, 2020. The next date on your timeline is public hearing and draft and beginning of public comment period, June 1st of 21. Obviously, there's gonna be more work going on in between those two dates, but I guess my question is, and I think you explained a little of this, but I wanted to go back and just make sure I understood it. Why wouldn't we deal with building block 1 sort of comprehensively up front, have the public comment period, and then while other work is parallel processing, why wait a year to go back and deal with it?
Yeah, you're picking right up on the conversation that we had with staff earlier today. So I think what we're trying to show with that slide was the sequence that we go through with each building block, and that sequence is repeated 5 times over.
Sure.
So what's different in Littleton here is that rather than us moving right into drafting, doing our own background research, and the first time you see it as a draft, there needs to be a lot more conversation, a lot more education of you and of us, so that we know very clearly what the form and massing and all those things are, what the expectations are. So we come away with some consensus points and some decisions before we draft Word 1, right? So that's what we're doing in downtown. We're gonna be building models, we'll be doing SketchUp models and stuff to say, is this what we're talking about? Is this the height? Is this the separation? Is this how we scale between different uses? Is this how we respond around historic structures or protect historic structures and historic character in certain parts of town or blocks? So we'll go through that, and then we'll get consensus about, yes, those are the things that we agree on. And then we will do our first iteration of drafting. And the draft will include graphics and all the meat on the bone. And we'll come back and say, did we get it right? What did we get wrong? What we want people to understand is when we come back to you, the farthest we're ever gonna get on any of these is probably 70%. Because we can't finish it until we do building block 2, 3, 4, 5, because we're gonna continue to discover and learn. And so we'll have to keep coming back. So that's why we say it's an iterative process. So we go this far with 1, and then we're still having conversations, we're still making changes to that, but behind the scenes, we're starting to progress on the next piece, but we're not putting the first piece to bed yet. We've had conversations about, when do we have conversations? What level of review do we have? Where does that happen in the process? Do we do it with each building block, or do we? So those are the things that we're still sorting out. And Kathleen, if you want to jump in, please do.
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces to doing this, and probably to your question too about the building blocks, part of what we like about this approach is that they are so interrelated, right? So that you get a chance to kind of look at in a context where you can combine all of those complexities and then sort of get that to a point, but then know that you're gonna have to reconcile each building block with each other. For many of our conversations, I think throughout the comprehensive plan and even internally, this is a big piece of how we see, or a big piece of the tool of how we see managing growth, right? So even the order in which we're approaching these building blocks is very intentional and meant to be, sort of that strategy, right? So when you think along the lines of managing growth, being able to look at downtown, corridors, mixed use, can we manage it there where we think there could be some change? Because we know how critically important it is to protect that neighborhood building block. And then the business commercial, of course, there is a financial implication to the comprehensive plan. We talked about that, throughout that process. So I think just being able to do those. Part of the challenge of producing pieces of this is that this isn't an exercise in redlining our existing code. It's kind of apples and oranges. So just making sure that we keep that pretty clear for everyone that's following this process, because our hope is that it is fundamentally different than the code we have.
I think it's good, to me, it seems a lot more tangible, that people can actually get their arms around it, which I think is an excellent outcome. The only thing that I'm mildly concerned about at this juncture is that while we're in process, a lot of things could be happening that are outside of where we're trying to go hypothetically. So it's a thought.
And that's
It doesn't keep us up,
right? Yeah.
Well, I guess what
And that's
needs to
what
be
we
the moratorium.
have to manage and keep track of, where are we seeing those pressures? What part of what we're doing can become a red line temporarily to meet those pressures that we're seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go Carol, then we'll get back to the folks that haven't asked any questions, and we'll go around again a second time.
You mentioned that the building blocks were unique or unusual. What would it be instead of building blocks if we weren't doing that?
Really, the other approach is just drafting chapter by chapter. So you could have 10 chapters, and usually it starts out by, drafting, figuring out all your districts and whether we're consolidating, looking at all the land uses in those districts, writing standards for certain uses, doing all the dimensional standards, and then reviewing those. What you don't see with that is how it relates to the bigger puzzle, right?
Oh, yeah, this seems great.
And then the next piece you get into building design standards and site design standards and parking, and then you move into the subdivision regulations, and then you move into the procedures. So we do that often for probably more straightforward codes, or where they're not, where we're not looking at a fundamental change in how we're intending to develop in the future. So that can work in certain areas, but here we really want to dig deep into understanding the ins and outs of downtown, how it got to be where it is, what the community vision is physically. You can only spell it out in words so many ways. We're gonna have to model it and show people, this is what it looks like, 3 stories, 2 stories, 5 stories, 4 stories, open space, parking, how do we deal with parking, setbacks, how do they relate to the street, how do people walk, all those things are so hard to visualize unless you can
That sounds
model
great.
them, right? So I think people will say, yes, that's what we wanna do. Great, that makes it easy on us to write, because we're writing to build this, right? As opposed to having some idea, but we have a different idea than you have. So that'll allow us to really drill down into downtown, understand it, model it, test it, get feedback from the community, draft it, test it, get feedback from the community, draft it again, and then continue to finesse it as we're working through the other parts. And each of the other models are gonna be doing this very same thing, you know, mixed use, what does that really mean? What scale, what character, how do we protect views, how do we protect river environs, how do we protect environment, how do we protect the economics of the future of this community? All those things that are so essential.
Did it, Carol?
Thank you.
Cool. Jason?
Just one piece of feedback I heard from someone who attended last night's meeting was that they found the future land use map and the building blocks map to be a little confusing, particularly corridor mixed use on the future land use map morphed into corridors block area, and there's a separate area on the building block named mixed use. So to have something that's mixed use moving into something that's not named mixed use was a little confusing for at least one person I spoke with last night. Just something to be aware of.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we tried to basically follow the future land use plan. So, you know, all the lavender areas here are mixed use. So this is the mixed use. We're calling it a building block. We can call it whatever you want to, but we tried to stay consistent, you know. We kind of took all of downtown, and there's a lot going on in downtown. We said we're gonna study that. That's the whole downtown area. That's the boundaries of our area. So we can kind of look at terminology and stuff to try to make it as understandable as we can. I appreciate that comment. That's the types of things we want to make sure that we can overlook things that we think make sense, but somebody else might look at it as a layperson and go, I don't get it, you know?
Yeah, it took me, I did a double take at the map and figured it out, but just the initial glance, it wasn't totally clear. And then this is probably more getting into the weeds, but one of the main goals of the comprehensive plan talks about quantity and diversity of housing options for a wide range of age groups and income levels. So one thing I'd be curious to know more about is what we'll be doing to support workforce housing through this zoning ordinance. And that may be more into the weeds than we need to go tonight.
Yeah, I won't go into the real specifics, but when you look at the middle map up there and you see the amount of yellow, what's there is there, right? And if we want to conserve the character of those neighborhoods, it's going to be a policy question of to what amount of change can you tolerate in those areas. If it's not those areas, then we look to these other areas of how do we accommodate different types and styles, and lifestyles of housing. So I know you've already had conversations and you're batting around this whole idea of accessory dwelling units. We will kind of show you best practices. These are all the different ways. I mean, it's entirely up to this community as to how you structure those, how big, where, what type. Everything is entirely up to you. But we can say, here's the menu of things that communities all across the country have done. And we can custom craft something if you want to go there. If you don't want to go there, then that checks one thing off. We set it to the side and say, okay, here's what's remaining. Obviously, we know we've got mixed use areas. Not everything has to be vertical. That's one option. You've got some of that in town now where you have either condos or rental apartments. But we could look at other smaller, more urban housing types that you probably see elsewhere in Denver. Or in Stapleton or something like that. So there's a broad range of different housing types. Our approach is really to lay out what we call a housing palette and say, here's all the different types of housing. Here's the dimensional standards for all those so they can be parked and so they function and they have adequate separation and so forth. And then figuring out where those pieces can fit. And then saying, these 3 housing types are permitted here. These 2 housing types are permitted here. The whole gamut of housing types may be permitted in some of these mixed use areas. And then you can set, density limits and say you can have this many units on that property. You figure out the range of housing types and how they interact with what's around them and transition. So we have all those standards. It's a tough nut to crack. And you see places like Minneapolis, that has said there's no such thing as single family. They're allowing all areas to have duplex and fourplex. That's very liberal, right? A lot of communities can't tolerate that. So we will work with you in terms of what makes sense for this community, what can work, and how can we make it work in terms of how we craft the standards and the protections that are built into that, so that we can create different types of housing. You know, you're largely built out, so you only have so many areas to deal with. So we'll have to be creative about, how do we get there?
We're starting to run low on time. I want to make sure everybody gets in. Kelly?
Hey, I'm Kelly. Thank you so much for everything that you've already done. I feel so confident and thankful that you're gonna be guiding us throughout this whole process. So I appreciate everything that you've already done so far. I will echo Jason's concerns about affordable housing. With the release of the BBC study in 2017, we do have a lack of affordable housing, and so that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and I hope that we have a very big conversation about that. I agree with Scott and Mark too about protecting the river corridor in Littleton. There's so many people within the city and without the city that use that river corridor in many different ways. And I know there's a lot of, and it's special. It looks, as soon as you hit, Englewood, it looks a lot different between Littleton and Englewood, the river. And I know that there's, private properties along that river corridor could be sold one day, and I think it's vitally important that we do pay attention to that, and what can go there in the buffers, in the transition zones. My question is, and it may not relate to this at all, I was thinking about the number of schools that we have within our different neighborhoods around the city. I don't know if they will be impacted by these new code changes, if we have schools closing, maybe new ones opening. I don't know. I don't know if they play some part in this discussion.
That's a very keen observation. To the extent that there's changes that this community makes that would change number of school-age children in a certain area, that could, overwhelm a local school. So I think that is something to keep in the back of our mind. We'll have to kind of look at where all the schools are and have maybe some conversations with the school once we start getting a little more meat to the bones. We have a little better idea of what some of these things mean. So yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. We certainly want to protect those neighborhood schools because they're such an anchor for those neighborhoods and such a focal point. So, mark on that point, and we'll make sure that we're considering that too.
David, did you have something? Anything?
No, good. I'm gonna chime in first though. Good. So on your slide 6, under the one side does not fit all.
Yeah.
Which says capacity, and I'm always about capacity. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that for us, please?
Yeah. So, I was telling Brian before we came here that I enjoy working in places like this because you have staff and you have good staff and trained staff that we can get into the detailed levels of conversations with them. What we have to be sure in working with them is that we're drafting a code that they can administer. And we heard earlier today that every single community struggles from this. We've got so many things that we don't have all the staffing to enforce. So we have to kind of think about that as we're drafting these. Does this community, does this staff have the capacity in terms of its staffing, the capacity of the commission and the council to process these things, to understand these things, and to being able to be effective in administering this code. So there's codes that are very, very sophisticated. There's codes that are simpler, so we need to find where that feel-good point is for Littleton. That's part of our charge. And so that's something that we'll ask staff to be pushing back on, is these processes are unique because kind of like once you uncover part of it, you want to see what everything else looks like, and you just keep, the scope can go like this and just, oh, well, gee, we need to address this, this, this. And we started seeing that with staff today, right? It's like, oh, well, this has been a problem. And so pretty soon you're writing 1,000 pages to address anything that could possibly ever happen to anybody on any property at any time. And so we've got to kind of say, you know, let's keep on the straight and narrow here. Let's make sure this code is something that our staff agrees with, that they are comfortable with, they're confident, they can explain it, they can apply it, they can test it, make sure that it's working the way they want to.
Excellent. Now also, as you learn more about our city, we talk about affordable housing. I presume we're talking about lower income folks. District 2, which is the northeast quadrant, as well as District 1's northwest quadrant, has the lower rents in our city. So that's just so you guys to know. So if we're gonna talk about affordable housing, maybe we can spread it out somewhere besides District 1, District 2. The other part, my last, and it's probably more for Mark, maybe Jen, I don't know. But when you start bringing codes to the planning commission and city council, are you gonna bring them to them just as one bulk, or are you gonna be bringing them in onesie twosies?
Here's 500 pages of code.
So we'll go into that a little bit more tonight, especially as it pertains to downtown. We have kind of a phase going on, but I think what Brett alluded to in terms of each of the building blocks, one of the thoughts that we have had is after each of the building blocks that we would bring it to planning commission, city council, or even just having it available in the encode format. The public would be able to go on and see it and actually make comments. So that is our intent, to have kind of that review document and building blocks. So you're not gonna get all however many pages it ends up being on June 1st of 2021. Yes.
Alright, thanks. I think everybody's been around the horn once, or unless Sherry, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I do, I have a quick question. Okay, I think you hit on this question a little bit, but we've had circumstances where, and we will in the future, say there's a piece of a parcel that's zoned commercial or industrial within a substantially residential neighborhood or something like that. How do we incorporate, or how do we understand the policy part of those decisions around particularly tax base? So if there's a piece of property, there's a request for a rezone and to a residential, then that would diminish tax base. Or there might be an existing commercial building that we have a applicant who might want to convert that to a non-tax generating use, such as forgive me, a nonprofit or public type institution.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I'm very glad that you have started that work in terms of looking at the fiscal component of this and building a fiscal model. That's gonna be very important. We've worked with cities that rely on sales tax, and so they wanted us to make sure that the uses that were going in were tax generating uses. The broader thing we have to look at is the market, so we have to keep, we can write a code that requires, all tax producing businesses, but do we have a market for that? Will those fill up, or are we fooling ourselves and creating all this industrial or business use that may never fill up? So it's kind of a fine line. But I think the way we do it is that's kind of one of those filters that we're gonna be looking at all the way through this and helping to make decisions. So as the point that you had started out there, if you have, a use that may be producing taxes, oftentimes just because of the compatibility and impacts, a city might say that's a non-conforming use, and our policy is that at some point in the future, it needs to go away. It may be different here. That may be something that is, a viable source of revenue source that you think is important to you. So when we get into those decisions, those are policy decisions that y'all help us make, but we will craft the regulations differently depending upon, what you decide is most important. We have done things where you can have, a creative example where we've done that is we created a way that somebody could go from being non-conforming to conforming through a process so that they have a path forward. And it could be that, for those things that haven't caused a lot of problems, that have been there, they're a good neighbor, they're contributing to the community. On paper, they're non-conforming, but they're okay where they're at. So why not give them a path to become conforming rather than non-conforming, which would allow them to reinvest and rebuild their property if something were to happen to it.
Anything else, Sherry? We might go about 10 minutes over, but that's okay, Scott.
So in the conversation city council's been having up to now, for some good reasons, some reasons of efficiency, we've been kind of assuming, kind of borrowing a definition of downtown. Based on what you and Brian have seen in your travels, should we be rethinking that definition? I've heard lots of proposals for what downtown ought to be defined as, west of the river, here or there. What are your thoughts?
Well, we've had some of those conversations with staff already. You've had 12 or 15 different studies that have all defined downtown differently.
Mark, you were there for how many?
So we tried to look across those and take in the areas that were most commonly defined as being downtown. We don't want there to be any misinterpretation that just because it might not be in a downtown that it's not going to be addressed as it relates to downtown. So we identified the area. We went, a little bit to the east of Littleton. Maybe it goes another block. Maybe it's not as far of a block. We will draft those regulations as we get further and further into it. Generally, you're taking in all those areas that are of a different character in terms of the physical characteristics of that area and the use mixtures that are, if there is a more dense or urban place in Littleton, it's that area defined. So don't feel like that just because a line is drawn in one place, when we draw the zoning map and the actual zoning districts, we may decide that it goes outside of that. That's just kind of our starting point for study. We'll do more detailed analysis when we start drawing lines and deciding this property should be within a downtown boundary.
This process that you talk about, bring code to us, once we get the first building block and we know we have to learn from subsequent, do we adopt it after we go through this process, or do we have to wait till the end of the 18 months?
To be determined.
And this is my preference to Bruce's point. While we're going through this process, every year we're losing more and more of our downtown. And that's why we started with downtown, which is great, because that's the area that we're losing the most. But things can slip in while we're figuring this out, and we can only do a moratorium realistically for a limited amount of time. We don't want to carry that on for 18 months, that's way too long.
That's
So that I think that's a real concern that we need to be cognizant of.
That's another reason why we've chosen the approach that we have, because we're gonna be drafting all the downtown regulations together at one time. So you almost could repeal and replace. Whereas if we draft it as we normally do, it would take us the entire 18 months to put all the pieces together. So by focusing on downtown, foreseeably, yes, you could do that if you choose to.
I would advocate some approach that would preserve it, not let things come in that maybe we wouldn't want, but we just don't have time to get it exact.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We agree. That's the issue.
I'm just gonna make more or less, I guess, two comments. I think the point up there about creating value is something to constantly keep in front of us. I think what you are laying out and what we're all talking about is a big value creating opportunity, and I just think that's really critical. And the other thing that you had in the page before this was the concept of multiple paths to yes. Again, it's always easy to come up with stuff that, you know, says, no, you can't do something. But I think getting it out there that Littleton is user friendly and accommodative in terms of how we interact with current residents, current property owners, and people who want to develop or redevelop is, it's a value creating attribute for our community.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Anybody else have any questions? City manager.
Thank you, Jerry. Just a couple of comments here. Like to just have the planning commission and the council just reflect for a minute where we've been for the last 2 years. And having gone through a whole visioning process and then, you know, the heavy lift of a comprehensive plan and to get that adopted last fall, and here we are tonight. And we finally are getting a glimpse about where we really wanted to get to in the end here was a code that could really manage growth. And so when all the feedback and the pushback we've heard from our community, it's just been our deep struggle. And now I hope that you can see little glimpses of what we're really gonna be talking about. And I'm really excited. It's been a long time coming to this point, but I think with KKC and the staff that we've got at this moment in time, we are gonna do some great things here. And I'm really excited for this community.
Yeah, and I think 2 years ago when we brought the comp plan up, we said 18 months. I think the then planning chair said absolutely no way, it's, you know, triple it. I think we ran them out of town, didn't we, Mark? Well, it was you. And I think this is just.
Wrong for the first time.
And I think this is just as aggressive schedule. And I think planning commission came through for the comp plan, and I can see this happening again.
Yeah,
Really
I would agree.
Okay. Anything else, planning commission, council?
Just one point, we mentioned that, we're working on the downtown area. Okay, we're gonna be changing the zoning code here very shortly. If we're working on the building block of downtown, in 6 months from now, we find some kind of sparkling gem that, whoa, we've gotta apply this, well, we'll go in and change the existing zoning code.
Right.
And still wait and then we'll wait till we get the brand new sparkling, you know, right off the rack.
Do what you need to
code.
do in the interim to protect your long-term interests. And then we will ultimately, you know, give you the whole set of regulations that will solve those issues. But we don't want you to wait and allow something to happen that you're gonna live with for the next 50 years, right?
I would just affirm that when we can find those gems, those areas of the code that come out of this process that we can fit in place while we're waiting the 18 months, we're gonna do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming into town on our snowy night.
Yeah,
Kathleen was all excited that you were in town, I know that. So.
They made it.
They made it. It wasn't snowing then.
The last thing I'd like to say is just, we really do want to work with you closely. This is a collaborative effort. We're all working toward the same goal. We're on your side. That doesn't mean that, you know, we may not come across things and work through issues to figure out how do we get to the end game at the end of time. But if we all work in a positive manner with one another, we can get this done. So we will collaborate with the community to whatever we need to do to get this code done and deliver a code that can be approved and liked and appreciated and respected by all the crooks and crannies of this community. It'll take a lot of conversations and a lot of education in multiple directions, but we're committed to that collaboration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guys. When do you guys head back?
12 noon.
Oh, yeah, okay, good. Well, I don't think we have any storms coming in.
We do, actually.
I'm trying to be positive here. Oh, we have no storms coming in.
We have another one. We have another storm.
Great, well, thank you very much. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? Why don't we get back at 8:15 for our next exciting planning commission? You can stay with us if you like. Yeah. this is the subject is to change the city code for downtown moratorium. And the purpose here though, Reed, you wanna use the purpose? I mean, I know we have it listed here, but
Yeah, generally the purpose is during this 90-day moratorium to do to do all three types of things. One of those is to address certain provisions within our city code that are inconsistent with the newly adopted comprehensive plan. And at another stage, you will hear about design standards, specifically a lot of the downtown design standards, which are also inconsistent with a lot of the provisions within our comprehensive code, as well as operational standards that the city has from an administrative perspective, which also don't mesh with those. So during the course of this moratorium, the purpose will be to discuss all three phases of that, from the code changes which we're hearing about tonight, from the design standards that you'll hear about on another night, as well as the operational standards. And hopefully at the end of that 90-day moratorium, we'll be able to enact all those changes, which will clear up a lot of those inconsistencies that we've seen. Depending on how close we get during that 90 days, what we identify throughout that process, if there are other things to clean up, I mean, we'll always be looking for opportunities to make those changes as they become evident and as the city receives enough public input so that they can make those educated decisions, including, the possibility for extending a moratorium. If we're really close, we're really on the edge, to potentially doing that. But tonight it's just gonna be talking about the code changes.
I guess to put it in a short word, one sentence, what I was hoping for. The focus of tonight's discussion is on the phase 1 change to the code that staff believes can be adopted before the end of the 90-day moratorium. And we've asked the Planning Commission to stay with us and fully participate. Mark.
Well, thank you, Mayor, but once again, I'm gonna go right to staff here, Jennifer, in this particular case.
So right before we took our break, you guys should have all received a copy of this.
We got plenty of them if you need them.
Everyone have this? So I think this is a little bit of a visual, what Brett started to lay out. So. Thank you, Mayor. So we're in this period right now at the top that's in the green, that we're having a series of study sessions to talk about those items within the design standards that City Council has already talked about. Unfortunately, Planning Commission has not had an opportunity to talk about yet because we had a very long hearing and had to postpone. And then we had a snow date. And then also the code changes, that's what we're talking about this evening, and then we'll have operating standards. So, and these are all the things that we think we can address in this short time frame. What is going to be informed are some of the things that you had on the downtown moratorium work plan. So this is one of the attachments that you had for this evening's study session. And if you see on this, there are two columns, one, the phase 1, and phase 2. So phase 1 has elements in the zoning code to be changed, in the design standards that are going to be changed, in the operating standards. There are elements in phase 2 that we do not feel we can address in this 90-day moratorium because we need to be having information that's going to come out of our downtown building block during our ULUC process. Okay, and that's kind of this middle, it'll be from, we kicked that off in March, is when we'll start that downtown building block, and that'll go until June. So a lot of what will come out of those Envision studios and the conversations that go on and the drafting that goes on will really inform these phase 2 changes, okay? And then that's when we'll come back to you. We'll also have our massing model by then that Brett referred to and our feasibility analysis using kind of our economic model as well with our downtown building block. And then that's when we'll be able to get into those phase 2 changes It might look like adopting what comes out of that downtown building block. But that's the progress. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
So for the purpose.
What's our options? You're gonna change it? As long as it makes sense to you.
No, it needs to make sense to you.
No, you're the one running this show, so it's gotta make sense to you.
So the items that you have in your packet, so we do have this, okay? For tonight's discussion, we are focusing on the zoning code changes. So that is this attachment. And if you look at this attachment, all the way over to the far right, you will see a column that actually has line numbers, say line 45 through 68. The other attachment that you have is the actual wording that is being proposed for the zoning code changes. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, so when we're going along and doing this, that's how you can follow along and know where we are doing. Again, zoning code changes only tonight. All right. Any questions? No questions.
Take it away.
So we'd explained where we are in this process. You know, on February 4th, the city council did formally adopt the 2 moratoria on downtown development. So those are now in place. And now we're having our joint study session this evening on the zoning code changes. So this evening, what we're asking for from council as well as planning commission is feedback on 12 proposed city zoning code changes related to, and these are the topics that you've seen all along: public engagement, development regulations, allowed uses, and parking. Hand it over to Mike to roll through these.
Sounds good. Good evening, council members.
What's your title this week?
I hope I get to make it up every week. Still Deputy Community Development Director. Good evening, everyone. So I'll kind of walk through these code changes with you. They are numbered in your chart, and they follow along directly with the code changes. So number 1 is construction activities. This we regard as a public engagement piece. We are proposing to change the construction hours to limit construction. This is worded in the negative, which is a little tough to wrap our heads around, but it prohibits construction during certain hours from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Monday through Friday. Moving on, if there are any questions about that, happy to answer. But we can move on. Just stop me when you have questions.
Stop asking people to stop you.
We added a definition for building, which was not present in the current code and led to some confusion. We've added number 3 and number 4, number 5 are somewhat related. Number 3 is dwelling multiple family. Number 5, I believe it is townhome. And these definitions would be mixed up a little bit in the developments we'd see downtown. And that created some confusion about parking requirements. This mainly related to condominium development, which is not addressed in our current code and is a big part of development today. So condominiums were placed in the multifamily section of our definition, of our proposed definition, which leaves townhomes to be homes that are situated side by side, have frontage on the street, are on their own individual fee simple lots. And we treat the parking for those in different ways, but this would help clarify some of that. Height of building, this is something we have argued with property owners and customers for quite a while.
Yeah, you're jumping pretty fast here. Line 35. Utilizes assumed walls between two or more supporting columns. I resurrected architect from hell here. If you have from the old days, if you have a L-shaped building and you infill the L and you only need one column, is that considered to be a structure or a building? Here you say two columns. It's nitty-gritty stuff here, but you say two or more columns.
Yeah, and what our intent there was is if you had a porch, let's say, that had two support columns and an assumed wall would be drawn between those support columns. So typically we see two support columns, but you're right, there may be a way to further refine that to make sure that the idea was that we would have an assumed wall.
I understand the idea, it's just there's situations where you could have one column, you need to address that. Like say infilling an L with a 10 by 10 addition or something.
Gotcha.
With a roof in one column.
And I have seen that before, so yeah, we would probably in that situation assume the wall between the building and the one column.
Right, one more
But
sentence.
we need to probably define that a little bit.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Building height. Right now, we measure height based on 4 data points, which has always been somewhat confusing. Staff worked on this quite a bit. We'd like to get that down to 2 data points. The point from the lowest grade to the top of the building and the point of the highest grade to the top of the building. We feel that that will simplify things. I've talked with Mark a little bit on this offline, our architect.
And I do have a question. I was gonna ask Mark Rudnicki, our architect from Hades. Because I know that you've struggled with this one often.
Yeah.
Have you had a chance to look at this one?
Well, there's two ways to get around this, and one is, let's say on the low side, a developer fills in and raises the grade and maybe has a giant window well on the backside. Anyway, that he raises that ups his average so he can get a taller building. What do you do with that? The second one is if they dig down and do a giant window well or a walkout, does that become the lowest grade?
I think we need to look at this in terms of downtown, and I've talked with Chairman Rudnicki about this. We're usually dealing with smaller lots, and the setbacks and yards are such that you've got very small setbacks, so there's not much opportunity to regrade a site downtown. And we haven't seen people do a lot of extreme regrading. That becomes more of a danger in areas where you have larger lots, that there's more opportunity to do significant grade changes.
But the changes you make, the code is gonna affect the whole city.
It affects the whole city, so yeah, we need to address that point. But our general thought on it was let's try and simplify things. And when we have a development that has a walkout, particularly it can be 30 feet on the front side and it can be 50 feet on the back side. And developers are able to manipulate the current height language to call that a 30-foot tall building, which we need to correct. And I think this would help correct that, although there are some issues we probably need to address in the making of this.
I just wanna make sure that the developers can't get around it, that we use expertise we have in the room to make sure we get what we want.
Right.
And not allow loopholes.
And with the holes we have now, that they will take advantage of it on occasion, and you'll be forced to say, oops, okay, well, it's allowed. And let them get away with.
They have
in the past, and they will.
Yeah.
And that's when we come back and fix it.
Again, yeah.
And this is a starting point. So we're gathering feedback here. We'll try and close some of those loopholes, keeping in mind that we wanna keep it simple. as much as we can, but trying to address that grade problem as well.
Where does the diagram go? I mean, is it published somewhere?
So the diagram we've got
Is it just
right
our-
I'm not sure
now,
what this is the proposed one that you see, our
You gotta change your
previous one
calculation.
has 6 different ways to measure it.
Well, your calculation, you need to fix that. If it's gonna be visible to anyone.
so right now we have a limited ability to do diagrams within the Sterling code. But we'll investigate that. We may be able to do a diagram in our operating standards of how we measure height, but we wanna get the language right.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, I just mean your formula there is not correct, so we gotta fix that if you put that anywhere.
okay,
Cause the height of the structure is not the average of the 2 points.
okay,
It's the highest point minus that average is the height of the structure.
okay. We will clarify that.
That's
great.
The structure.
Good catch, Dave.
We're separating the two.
Actually, I have a question about that then. So, I mean, I've seen it where it says historic grade or natural grade. I think that gets away from maybe what Mark was saying, is that people will grade to their advantage. So you have to go with the historic grade.
Historic grade. Yeah, we looked at several different definitions from different communities when we developed the height language that's proposed, but we'll relook at that and see if we can address historic grade or maybe we'll incorporate terms like that help.
Greenwood Village uses a historic grade, so they dig out the old contour maps from whatever, the 50s or 60s, and even though the house has been built and the grade's been raised or whatever, berms, you have to go by that old map.
Right. We're trying to figure out what we can administer.
Yes.
As we roll through that process, yeah.
Those contour maps?
So, ready to move on, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. I was incorrect earlier, it's number 6 that clarifies townhomes, not number 5. So number 5 is permitted encroachments. This is a struggle that we've worked with and looked at in different ways at different times in the city. At one point, I think we did look at setbacks measured to basically from the property line to the building wall. And as we read the code, we discovered we were incorrect. That the setback is measured to the furthest extent of the structure, which includes the eave and the gutter and anything else. And that's the way the code reads. So I think we'd be more in line with other communities and best practices if we codified some encroachments that are permissible, such as eaves or cantilevered chimneys, perhaps bay windows. And Mark is, Chairman Rudnicki has talked to me about this, that we probably need to tighten those a little bit, make sure that nobody puts in a 50-foot wide bay window.
No other municipality allows bay windows and side setbacks.
No, I think there may be another, or at least a few. There can be some.
We don't have to though.
If they're cantilevered and not part of the foundation.
Still.
You guys can go have coffee and figure it out.
So, but yeah, the point of it is that there can be some items on the side of the building that help give the sides of the building character rather than a straight shot down of the wall down the side. So
Eliminate limit the width and limit the number of bays if you're gonna allow them.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see, we talked about the townhome piece, number 6. Number 7 is an amendment to the P4 process, which would allow applicants to present briefly during a P4 meeting, and that's the preliminary project plan process is what P4 stands for. It's a tongue twister.
How is that different than we do now?
Right now, we do not allow applicants to present, it's just staff.
Just staff.
It's staff.
Oh, present, that's right, okay.
Yeah,
Present or
do a
answer
presentation
questions.
and perhaps answer questions, which could be, could help clarify and give a more direct answer to questions that the council has and planning commission has.
I would like that to be very brief, a controlled time, very brief. I'm concerned about developers making a pitch. We've seen it before.
Inevitably.
I would like to consider doing this for planning commission and also HPB and there may be other boards. As we have had problems in the past, applicant works with staff for a year, they think they've got everything staff wants, and they come before the commission, and the commission goes, oh my God, no, we don't, that doesn't meet the criteria we have established. So if they could come before planning commission and HPB and just do a conceptual solution?
That's currently the way, right now, the P4 process is for planning commission and city council. We could look into extending that to HPB.
I think it would be very helpful.
We could also look into extending that to major site development plans. Possibly.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any other board commission, but I advocate for HPV.
Okay.
At least,
Sounds
in
good.
addition to planning.
And we will try and send the design standards to a study session with HPB as well.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? We have make a brief presentation. What in your eyes is brief?
3 minutes.
That's not enough time. It's brief, that is brief, but they need to be able to really give us an idea and, whatever.
The ones we've had have been brief enough. I mean, they don't last, they're not marathon sessions. Between the applicant presentation and questions and answers, it might be a half an hour. Or at least that's my experience with the couple that we've done.
It's well worth the time, because when we had that situation, we spent a lot of time working back and forth with the applicant, and the poor applicant had to then hire the architect to redo the plans. It was not cost effective for him or time effective for us, so. A half hour, maybe a longer presentation could save everybody a whole lot of time and money. Okay, thank you.
Again, you were moving pretty fast. I have comments on, bore everybody to death with the zoning geek here, but the line 85, 86, unenclosed and uncovered porches, raised patios, decks, uncovered stairs are allowed in you're now proposing to allow them in the rear and front setbacks. And I drew up the example of a rickety stairway that goes from the ground level to the second floor in the front setback supported by 4x4 columns. Do you want to look at that in a front setback? No. So that needs to be, and then raised decks. What if you have a 5-foot deck in the front setback? Is that appropriate? It's not. So you'd have to have a limit on the height the deck could be above the ground level, and you have to get rid of the stairs allowed in the front setback.
Okay.
There are other little minor things, but the consequences are pretty what's the word, significant.
It depends on the type of deck. I mean, your typical front porch that, the stoop you think of that's a covered porch that sits in the front yard is
covered
desirable, and in fact, actually not allowing covered porches in the front setback could, contradict what is a common new urbanist design principle.
Let it go, sure. Okay.
That's good, yeah, right now we see people detaching decks. Just slightly, they butt up against the building, but that's how they get around the setback requirement, which seems strange. we were trying to address that part, but appreciate your comment. Let's see. Number 8, mail notice to property owners and property address. So right now, we only mail notice to property owners, who may be located out of state and may have some difficulty getting the notice to the resident who lives at the address. So in our proposed revision, we would mail at least one notice to the physical address, whether the owner is out of state or not.
Good.
So do they have to post that in an apartment building lobby or?
So that's been a discussion that we've had, how would we write that in there, for a structure that has multiple residences in there, we would not require one to be delivered to each apartment.
Because the post office, the postman's just gonna throw it in the lobby on the floor because there's no mailbox for just the address.
Right, there could be an address that has unit A, B, C, D, and E, and what will the individual postal delivery person do?
Yeah, I mean,
when
he's not
confronted
gonna
with that?
hang it up or anything, he's just it's not gonna be deliverable.
That may raise some concerns that we don't have the authority to go into other people's buildings and post notices on their property generally. Only when people are doing bad things do we wanna post stuff on the front of their door.
Right, that's not what I'm suggesting that won't happen because you're just gonna mail it to no address because the addresses in the building have unit numbers and there is no address that doesn't have unit numbers. The postal person isn't gonna hang it up, so nothing's gonna happen. It's ineffective in that case.
And we do often hear that people didn't receive notice, which is something else to look at.
And we have 3 types of notice, internet, posting the property, and mail notice. And this would be it may not solve all the problems, but it would be at least a step in the right direction of if it could be delivered, it gets delivered to a person that actually lives there. It doesn't solve all the problems though.
At the risk of wordsmithing here, it's line 130 where we say to each address and property owner address. Address is used a lot there. Could it say to the occupant where there's no, where the owner is absentee would be the occupant, right? It might be
Each occupant.
right?
Yeah, and I worry about how we get that done, but I will look into that and see if we could possibly get it to occupants.
Yeah, I mean, you're opening yourself up as well if you say to each occupant, cause that makes it difficult, especially with a lot of
Each person
units.
living there.
Well, yeah, but you don't wanna necessarily have to say, cause currently we're just mailing it to owners. You don't wanna then open it up to, we have to send it to each and every occupant because, that's our new rule, but then if we don't get it to every single occupant, then you open yourself up to something. I don't know if it's a lawsuit, but complaints at least. Not that
There's
we're not
probably
already
some
getting.
language we could add that says to the
Some
best
percentage.
effort,
Yeah.
we will try and the best effort counts as a good
Yeah.
notification.
Something like that.
I'm sure there's some language out there we could steal.
Yeah.
Land uses, and this is one of the critical pieces, number 9, we would change the land use table to have auto-oriented uses as a conditional use in the downtown area. And it would add this is starts on line 151. And includes under line 166, the table of uses, which we have revised since the moratorium was adopted to address the bank issue. But it would revise that table to make sure that all of those uses are now conditional uses in the downtown area.
Is there a time limit on conditional uses? I think there is. Would they have to reapply, or has that gone away?
No, that is currently in effect. If the business is abandoned or is changes use for a period of more than 1 year.
Okay.
The conditional use is then void.
So if the conditional use for like a restaurant, the restaurant's around for 30 years, it's good for 30 years?
Correct, as long as it's in continuous operation.
Is that, excuse me, that asterisk point, conditional use required, is that supposed to be tied to C above? Or why does it just have an asterisk?
Well, so we're talking about the zoning code, which the downtown area has several different zoning districts. For example, there is a B2 zoning district in the downtown area. Well, we don't want to change the entire B2 zoning district in areas on Broadway, for example, or on, Bowles or different areas that are outside of downtown where auto-oriented uses might be appropriate. But that's why the asterisk says, well, if this is a B2 area, generally it's okay, but look at the asterisk, if it's in the downtown area, then it's a conditional use downtown.
Can you switch to the next slide to show the example?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Right, so for example, the CA district is really just downtown. So that first column, financial services such as bank savings and loans and brokerages, and in your red line version of the code, it includes that incorporate drive-through services. But it's not listed here. In the CA district, we just changed the P to C, which is conditional. In other areas like I-2, where there are I-2 areas outside of the downtown area, we put the asterisk in and say, well, if your I-2 area happens to be located downtown, then that's now a conditional use. Does that make sense?
Yes, as long as it makes sense to other people.
It's a tricky,
It's just kind of
it was a tricky identifying how we could address conditional uses just in downtown is a little bit of a trick in our code. And this was the solution we came up with that could help identify, hey, if you're outside of the downtown area in an I-2 district, you're okay as a permitted use, but inside downtown, we want you to see the planning commission as a conditional use.
Mike, how much of this do we think is gonna be translatable to the ULUC?
Again, we're not rewriting the ULUC, it's a brand new document, so it will look different. But as we're doing these amendments, they absolutely will be taken into consideration for the content of the ULUC.
The intent will stay intact, but the method by which it's done will be different, simpler.
And this is just focused on the ones that we think we can do within the moratorium.
Correct.
So are we coming back to these topics at a later point? Or are we doing this kind of once and for all for the downtown right now?
These will be explored again during the downtown building block.
What did you say again, I'm sorry?
These will be explored again in the downtown building block. And we make sure, yes, we do wanna continue doing this, or, now that we have more information and have had a bigger conversation, that's not what is the best for the city moving forward. Does that make sense?
Almost there, man, keep going.
Alright. Number 10, simplify site triangle measurement. And this requirement in our current code is probably not done to the best practices of the region. Mark's shaking his head.
It is not.
So right now, our code's fairly antiquated. It prescribes a corner or a site, and is everyone, well, let's see, site distance triangles are designed to provide safe sight distance at corners for vehicles and pedestrians. Right now, our code prescribes a 35 by 35 foot triangle on each corner property that begins at the property line, which is very unusual in modern codes or in the metropolitan area.
Well, it's things like this that has made Littleton unique.
That's one way of looking at it.
Now we're just changing to everybody else.
Yeah, what we are proposing is that we would defer the site distance triangles to the standards established by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, commonly known as AASHTO. That is a more sophisticated tool that factors in posted speed limits, traffic regulation devices such as stop signs versus traffic signals, and also curvature of roads. And it gives a much better or a more well-established site triangle that's safe according to experts. And it doesn't change very often, but it is, they do studies on this periodically and can change it occasionally, and that would change our code as they change their standard. But it's a much more well-accepted standard for site distance triangles.
Is there a situation in which it increases the required sight line from the 35 degrees to say 40, 45 degrees, or is it effectively just reducing the sight line?
No, it is possible that it could increase the area that is encumbered by a sight distance triangle, particularly on a very busy street. However, in practice, we suspect that it will generally decrease the encumbered area of a lot. Number 11 is accessory structures, which we struggle with each and every year. We've proposed some changes to the accessory structures code to align better with the building codes. Right now, in zoning, we measure accessory structures by roof area, and the building code measures them by floor area. So for example, a 120 square foot shed is exempt from a building permit. Well, in the building code, they're talking about floor area. In the zoning code, we talk about roof area. We would like to revise that to just floor area, so we don't have to fight all the time. Which would, would be a giant step forward. Also, with the changes to setback, where we might allow some encroachments for porches, if we can refine that language. We would also recommend that there be some minimum distance between accessory structures and primary structures, which is a common practice in other jurisdictions, but it would help separate accessory structures like sheds from primary structures like houses, and provide some minimum separation between the two.
Jason?
Just wondering whether 5 feet is deemed sufficient for an accessory structure separation, and what other communities have done, because 5 feet is basically my arms.
Yeah.
So if you're allowing roof overhangs, then you might have 2 feet of roof overhang, 2 feet of roof overhang, 1 foot of airspace above that corridor. Just something to consider whether 5 feet is enough.
5 feet also applies to the building code. So when you're talking about separation and how walls have to be treated, that 5 foot from the property line or from each of their structure. So that's how we had arrived at the 5 feet, but I definitely see your point.
I've seen jurisdictions do 7.5 feet. So yeah, there could be some discussion about what an appropriate distance is. Generally, 5 feet is a walkable distance that, you know, if you get down below 5 feet, it's a little bit more difficult to walk in between the structures. Although you can go as little as 3 feet and still be able to walk in between.
Fire department doesn't care, do they?
They care, I believe they care mainly about distance to property line. But I'll check on that. Let's see.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
207, 208, garages must be set back, let's say from the alley 20 feet. If the garage has direct access to the alley. I noticed that a couple of the buildings, the condo units downtown, the garages are 5 feet away from the alley. What gives there? Is there a special exemption for CA or something?
So those predated the requirement for 20 feet for detached garages. So they are,
No, so they're brand new.
They're attached though, right?
No, they're not attached. One building, they're not attached. There's a gap.
Mark, what's CA?
What's that?
What's CA?
Central area.
Central area district, north of Main Street, It's just, I was just curious, they're 5 feet back where this calls, it's been on the code for quite a while, 20 feet back.
yeah, that, we can look into that, as there have been some variances granted, really recently for that provision. However, you know, through the Board of Adjustment, some people have requested variances, but there shouldn't be a lot of brand new buildings that are, brand new garages that are 5 feet from an alley line.
This is the last couple of years at most, maybe less. It's a brand new building, I think off in Nevada.
Is it right by Littleton Crossing?
Sorry?
Is it right by Littleton Crossing? Cause there was one
There
right
was a
next to
variance for
Littleton Crossing, that
Okay.
variance.
Yeah, don't know the name of the building. Okay, if it was a variance, that explains it.
Yeah. Let's see, so accessory structures. Oh yeah, everybody's favorite topic, parking. Almost there. So we had talked about changing parking requirements, but I think that would be more of a phase 2 type discussion.
Please.
Yeah.
This is phase 1.
What we had proposed was to change the minimum parking space size from 20 feet in length to 18 feet in length. And to change the, right now it's 20 feet by 9 feet. Generally, across the metropolitan area, most parking requirements are 18 feet by 9 feet. Yeah, compact spaces, we had proposed changing from 18 feet in length to 15 feet in length, which is in general practice around the metropolitan area. It could make a big difference in the design of parking lots and how much space parking lots take in the city.
Are you limiting the amount of compact parking spaces as it pertains to, well, right now, parking counts, required
Yes.
parking counts? Okay.
Yes, that's currently in the code that they can be no more than 20%, I believe it is, of required parking spaces. And that's fairly common.
Hey, Mike, I know this is maybe not the best place, but you know, I'm hearing people that are doing the slot homes, they have a parking garage, but they're using that parking garage for storage. Now they're parking on the street, right? So maybe somewhere along the way we can address that and I don't know how you curb that, but it's swallowing up parking spaces for people that actually need them, not for the tenants there because they're storing all their crap in the garage.
It's a tough nut to crack.
It is.
Yeah. You know, HOAs can do a pretty good job with that. cities have a more difficult time, but we can take a look into it.
Just some considerations.
Again, Chairman Rudnicki on this pointed out that in changing the parking space requirements, we should probably change the handicap space requirements to make sure the lengths match up. Generally, you wanna have handicap spaces that fit into the flow of the regular spaces, and if our handicap spaces have to be 20 feet in length, we've got a little disconnect there, so we'll work on that as well.
Mike, what about the fact that there's so many big vehicles out there? I mean, it's hard to maneuver in a parking lot if you have a big vehicle.
We do have
For larger.
4-foot lanes required, which is a little bit above, 23-foot lanes required, excuse me. We usually require turning movements when we do site development plans, we'll ask for turning movements to show that cars can actually fit into the spaces that are being shown.
Is that in here?
The turning movements aren't part of the code, but are part of our operating standards. So we take a careful look at that anytime we see a new development designing a parking area.
Council looked at this years ago and the council decided not to change it because nobody's saying that they have too much space. So now we're gonna decrease it.
Yeah, it was, I understand it was quite an issue when it went before council the first time. It's one of these things that staff would recommend as a way to meet best practices. But as you had noted, this has been discussed before and not changed.
Mostly width, that's an issue though, right?
Scott
That's
can chime in here too.
How does this factor into the much larger conversation we're gonna have about parking? Why are we able to bite this one thing off and talk about it now without it affecting like a set of dominoes, the rest of our conversation about parking?
It has the potential to morph into a larger discussion. However, we do, at least staff feels that there's some norms to parking spaces that we see around the metropolitan area that citizens, have brought up to staff before that this is an opportunity. But if this is not the right time, this is not the right time.
I wanna be clear on
And
this.
Carol
I'm sorry.
was up next.
I would like to point out that maybe this is what you're trying to accomplish, besides conforming to best practices, is if the spaces are shorter, there you can get more of them in at the same area, so a few more cars along the street. And with the longer spaces, it seems the spaces in downtown Littleton are inordinately long. And people don't pay attention to where they are in the space, so you have a lot of wasted space,
There's also an argument to be made for impervious surface. So when you have that 2 feet and stretch it over a parking lot, you're adding more impervious surface, which can lead to sustainability issues, in terms of the runoff that it's producing. So there's that argument. There's also the cost associated with additional pavement or additional concrete to provide a parking space, and who bears that cost?
Let's go Pam then Craig.
I just think either turning radius or size, somehow we need to make those parking so that you can get in and out. Ideally with a larger vehicle, but even, I don't have a larger vehicle and I have trouble getting in and out of certain parking lots. I agree the downtown, the ones, the parallel ones are maybe a little bit long, but I'm thinking you're talking about other areas, not just the front of downtown. So I would advocate either keep the parking spaces longer or make sure that there's the right turning radius so you can get in and out without scraping your car or knocking somebody next to you.
Alright, we'll go Craig and we have 10 minutes to do 2 more slides.
Yeah, the way I look at these is they're minimums, and it by setting them as minimums, you're allowing the market to determine what the actual size should be, and then the developers are smart. They're either gonna try to, get as many spaces in there, but they're really gonna try to cater to the needs of whoever's using that area. So they might build them to the minimum, but if they feel that they're gonna have a lot of bigger vehicles in there, they might build them, they can build them bigger.
Good example of that is Costco. When you go to Costco, the spaces are very wide and there's
Double striped.
double
It's a
striped.
huge lot.
Yeah.
Good point. All right, 2 more slides, Michael.
So next steps to go from here. So we are going to release the blue line revisions, so these revisions that we have with the blue lines on Littleton plans in the form of survey questions and allowing people to provide us red line versions of our blue lines. So that will be released to the public next week, and we'll have that open for a month. So this will be the code, the zoning code changes, as well as the design standard changes. So those will be out there. We'll be having a planning commission study session on the design standards. Again, that has been postponed a few times, so we'll have that. And then yes, and we're actually going to have HPV join planning commission on the 24th for that study session. And then March 9th, city council will take a look at the operating standards, and again, those are administrative documents right now, so they don't need an ordinance or a resolution for those. But we wanna bring those to you. We'll close public comment on the 17th of March. And then we'll take a week to basically review those comments, take into consideration the comments we've received on all the study sessions we've had with planning commission as well as city council. And we'll create revised ones that we will bring back to you in the form of the study session in March and April. And then we are looking to have the first reading of the new proposed design standards as well as the code changes on May 5th and then second reading on the 19th.
Jerry? I thought the 9th was going to be postponed because many of us were out of town.
They're gone for National League of Cities.
And you were thinking about canceling that study session because 3 of us were gone?
You are correct.
March 9th, so just no.
Yes.
Yeah, the 10th is the actual study session date, so the 9th must be a Monday. That'd be.
And that's planning
Is that
commission.
planning commission?
That planning commission?
Maybe that's
Okay,
what it is.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a little
Okay.
typo there,
Typo on
thanks for
there.
catching that. But I've canceled it, I can assure you, I've canceled the 10th for council.
You're welcome.
So any questions on process, zoning code changes?
Oh, we have one.
A big fat thank you to putting the designs, the code changes in the same order as the spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just quickly on the construction activity times, is that specific to building construction? And has nothing to do with road construction, is that correct?
The intention is that building construction, and really that was in response to really what we've heard from citizens, residents downtown, that they really just have construction fatigue with all the construction, so having more of a break. I know in terms of road construction, we have to get special exceptions for a lot of our city-run road projects to do them.
Well, I'm just specifically thinking of high traffic corridors, you don't really want them construction activity during the day on that. Most roads, they'll only allow it at night, overnight.
Typically, if there's emergency work is exempt from those, you know, city emergency work is exempt from those requirements.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking of your times that if it were road construction, in a business district in a high traffic area, you wouldn't want that, like through on Main Street, you wouldn't want, you'd have a huge traffic jams if you were trying to work during the day.
Thanks, Dave.
Or the Denver water stuff that's coming up in
Oh,
downtown
that's
too.
That's a whole other deal.
Can I just comment on that, Mayor? Just, Public Works does all the permitting in the right of way. And so they pay very close attention to which right of way and at what time and what's the scale of the work. Trying to, in essence, Dave, avoid, say, work on prints at, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. So they are very careful about that. In some cases, you do have emergency work, obviously, it just has to get done, but most of the time, Public Works pays pretty close attention to that.
Yeah, I just didn't wanna say, oh yeah, you can't work at midnight in a bit on Main Street when that might be a good time to do it.
Yeah.
I thank you very much, but before we wrap up and start packing up, I know the city attorney has no report, but I know the city manager, if we get to hear that, so we can all get out of that sooner.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, I sent council an email here this afternoon. I'm not looking for a response here this evening, but I just wanna bring that to your attention in case you missed that. But I had suggested a couple of, what I hope were kind of quick fixes here, and put on the council's consent calendar for next week. One of which was the change to your legislative rules, and this was how reflecting the council stuff here. And then the next one was the next gen bylaws. We had a study session, if you remember, with council. There was a couple of proposed changes to the bylaws that were fairly minor, and it looked like council was supportive of that. So I sent those to you. Please take a look. If you have an issue, let me know for next week.
Good.
Okay,
All right, anything else?
No.
We are adjourned. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.